A logical fallacy is something we all encounter in everyday life. This is when a person says something that appears to prove a point, but really it falls short. Sometimes they can be obviously wrong, and other times they can really fool you into believing that something isn't true. Never think that you should learn logical fallacies just so that you can prove everyone wrong. The main reason you should study logical fallacies is to make you a better listener when people try to fool you. Any irrational logic that you encounter in life falls into a category. We call these categories logical fallacies. By learning these fallacies, you can calmly listen as a person tries to trick you. As you are listening, you'll notice the fallacy they use is one you are already familiar with from your own study of them. This way you won't have to interrupt the other person just to tell him or her exactly what's wrong with what that person has just said. Instead, you can simply let them finish talking, all while you are fully familiar with what is wrong with what the person has said. This allows you to listen to other issues. You may agree with some of what the person says, or you may notice some emotional struggles in the other person. These are some of the benefits of being able to listen without needing to interrupt just for the sake of keeping things clear. A second benefit, though, of learning logical fallacies is that the type of fallacy a person chooses often tells you something about the motivation behind why the person is saying that. A special thank you goes to Michael Ramsden's Logic and Fallacies for all the videos in this series. Please download that lecture at bethinking.org. Shifting the burden of proof is a fallacy by many names. It can be called the onus, and the burden of proof can be called the onus, among other things. This occurs when someone claims that a thing is true. He or she has declared a truth. But then you are expected to disprove the claim. If you fail to disprove it, then the claim is declared to be true. One common example of this is any conspiracy theory. A person once told me that global warming was the way that the Antichrist will take over the world. He said that it was a global problem and a fake one, and that's how the Antichrist will unify the world under his government. In this example, we have a conspiracy theory. The man made a claim. What is tempting is to attack his theory and try to show why it is wrong. This is a mistake. He has simply made a claim. The responsibility is on him to prove it. If he cannot offer any justification, then you are under no obligation to believe his claim. If you engage in any attempt to disprove his claim, then you're probably being tricked. That's the trick. It will appear that if he can poke holes in your attack on his conspiracy theory, then his position is somehow backed up by that attack. In reality, if he cannot offer anything to positively back up his claim, then there's no reason for anyone to believe it. Now let's illustrate what I mean here. Imagine that I told you that there's a teapot on Mars. You cannot prove me wrong, so that means I'm correct, doesn't it? Now you can trot out tons of science and astronomical data and all kinds of photos and everything, research on top of research. But I can respond by just saying that scientists have only studied spots on Mars other than the spot where the teapot is. So you can't disprove me. And I've poked holes in all kinds of your criticisms of me. Does that make me correct? Now, imagine that I also told you on another day that there are 0 teapots on Mars. None at all. You cannot prove that wrong either, can you? So since you can't prove either wrong, there must be 0 teapots on Mars and 1 teapot on Mars. This is why the burden of proof is always on the one making the claim. Now, in the example from earlier, I simply asked the man to back up his conspiracy theory with some evidence. And he responded by just explaining his theory in greater detail. I repeated my question by saying that explaining what you think is not the same thing as giving evidence. He then dropped the point altogether and simply said nothing, as other listeners began a different line of conversation. Now let's take a look at just one more example. This time, a man told me that he only tells people about Jesus if the Holy Spirit speaks to his heart and tells him to do so. He said that it is an exception for people who already talk with him regularly about Jesus. In other words, he said I was an exception. He could talk with me about Jesus because we talk about Jesus all the time. But with someone else that he doesn't know if they're a Christian or not, he has to have the Holy Spirit tell him to tell that person about Jesus. I told him that I think you can just talk to people about Jesus the way you normally do and just bring up Jesus the way you would bring up other subjects. You talk to these people normally, just bring up Jesus with them. He said that I was wrong. And he claimed that I cannot bring up any Bible verses to demonstrate anything other than his view. He said you can't find anything other than that point of view in the Bible. I told him that there's at least one passage where the Holy Spirit leads someone directly to a person to talk about Jesus. So clearly there's an example of that what he's talking about can happen and has happened. But the issue is why he thinks this is always the case, just because it happens one time. If there's no verse to make this claim that it's always the case, then why should we believe this claim? And why should there be a verse that explicitly states that the Holy Spirit doesn't always have to tell you who to talk about Jesus with? In other words, if no such verse exists, then should we not assume that conversations about Jesus can happen just like other conversations? Over and over we read that, people like Paul just went to cities and it doesn't give details. It just says he told the people there about Jesus. Why should we assume that the Holy Spirit told him exactly who to talk to in every single situation? If this claim cannot be backed up with evidence, then we are under no obligation to believe it. That is how the burden of proof works.